Welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast and our Q&A segment, Ask the Colson Center. I'm Shane Morris, and I'm here with John Stonestreet answering your questions. These questions are based on Breakpoint commentaries and podcasts that we've aired, short courses we've held, and articles and columns that we've posted. And I kind of like to think of this time as the behind the scenes or the making of bonus features segment on some of my favorite movies, because we want to have these discussions to really get behind the commentaries and articles that you enjoy at Breakpoint, and to help you understand our thinking a little bit on some of these important issues. And often these questions, John, really challenge me to think harder about this stuff, and that's definitely going to be the case this week. We've got some tough and incisive questions. So,
yeah, and it's no surprise our first question is immediately about the story of the week. We record a weekly conversation called Breakpoint This Week, and it's on our podcast, as well as on, I think about, 500 or 600 radio outlets every weekend. And the timing is always tough, right? Because we record on Thursday and then something happens on Friday and then it airs on Saturday. And that certainly is what happened this week with the death of Supreme Court Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg.
Yeah, so a reader writes in to us this really good question. After Ruth Bader Ginsburg died, I saw numerous Christian friends on Facebook quote and pay homage to her legacy. They don't even say, I don't have the same worldview or beliefs, but she was an amazing woman, etc. No, it's actually an outright praise of the life of Ruth Bader Ginsburg. While I realize she was a brilliant trailblazer that pushed much needed legislation for women in the workplace, and here we're actually getting into some of that praise here, it's almost ironic, and made great strides for the rights of minorities and those with disabilities, it disturbs me to see folks paying homage to her while knowing her war against the unborn and the sanctity of marriage. Even the chair of our board of the Pregnancy Care Center quoted her on social media after her death. While the quote was positive and encouraging us to fight for what we believe in, I can't help but remember that this Supreme Court justice used her power to vote against bans on partial birth abortion and aided the plight of the sexual revolution at every turn. Okay, so what do we make of the legacy of Ruth Bader Ginsburg? This is a very interesting question.
It is. And there's really two questions here. I mean, one is how do you talk about people like Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who certainly will go down as a historic figure, but maybe for reasons that are contrary to a Christian worldview, which I think is true, or, really a mixed legacy, with the bulk of her legacy being negative because of how her decisions advanced the sexual revolution, and how especially she tied women's value and women's rights to an ability to kill their children. And that is going to be the central part of her legacy, kind of forever. But part of this, Shane, and before we get into the legacy of this Supreme Court justice, this, who certainly is a historic figure, at least in terms of her stature on the court, there's at least something I think here to say about the limited capacity of social media posts to say everything. Literally this morning, I saw my friend Ed Stetzer put something on Twitter, and this is, there's maybe one or two things that get under his skin every once in a while, and this was one of them. He goes, here's my latest article, and I'm sorry to everyone who thinks I didn't say everything possible that needed to be said from every angle in a 1,000-word article. There's limitations to the delivery system. We get this all the time on Breakpoint. Well, what about this, and this? I'm like, right. Well, if I were writing Summa Theologica, then I would pick a completely different, delivery mechanism, than a 3.5 minute audio and print commentary. There's something about that that's limited. But I also understand the question here, which is, well, what should you say if you can't say everything about somebody like Ginsburg? And but there, there's at least something here first about the limitations of the delivery mechanism itself, I think.
Yeah, for sure. And then when we say stuff like, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was a remarkable individual, well, I mean, that's obviously true. But I'm not sure how much content a statement like that really carries. I mean, I could say Oliver Wendell Holmes was a remarkable individual, but there's definitely aspects of that Supreme Court justice's legacy that I would be very critical of. And so when someone dies, I think the first thing we ought to remember is first and foremost that they are human beings, right? And then we can secondarily talk about them as what they represented ideologically or politically or legally or whatever. I think we should be decent, decent and speak of the dead in a way that acknowledges their humanity. So, Ruth Bader Ginsburg was this incredibly well-known figure in the life of our nation, but to her children, she was a mother. To her grandchildren, she was a grandmother. I think that's the substance of what people mean by "don't speak ill of the dead." I don't think we ought to pretend that her legacy is anything other than what it is, but we should first start speaking of people as human beings, and that's so hard in our polarized political climate. But I think it's something we've got to do, not just so that we're treating people the way God would have us treat them, but also to free ourselves up to actually then talk about the legacy in a meaningful way, because people aren't the sum of what they do on the job, but Ruth Bader Ginsburg will unquestionably be remembered primarily for what she did on the bench.
Yeah, and look, part of this has to do with having a worldview that understands both creation and fall. If you understand creation, then you understand that Ginsburg's inherent value isn't what she did; it's who she was as an image bearer of God. If you understand the fall, then you understand that that she made some remarkably bad decisions and stood for some remarkably bad causes, and yet she did it in a very powerful, strong way, which reflected being made in the image of God. So we have to also avoid, as Christians, looking at the kind of this moral milieu that we live in which we're talking about image bearers making bad decisions, to draw this line as if we're the good guys and they're the bad guys, as opposed to recognizing kind of who we all are. And the other thing that I think can be helpful is just recognizing worldview. This is the power and importance of worldview. I mean, Ginsburg ruled in such a way that reflected what she deeply believed. And by the way, I do want to mention that I had a conversation this week, and it's live and up on our podcast, with Kim Colby, who is of the Christian Legal Society. She's been a remarkable champion for years of campus freedom issues, and she has. She and I talked for probably 30 minutes or so about the legacy of Ginsburg, and we walked kind of through this because, as a female, Kim Colby, who is also a graduate of Harvard Law, and so on, there were some things that Ginsburg led and pushed through that gave her the sort of opportunities that she had. And yet, Ginsburg tied that same movement, what we would call second wave feminism, to so-called reproductive rights, which of course aren't rights at all for the unborn, and basically is abortion. And as many people have pointed out, there's this kind of irony happening right now as we have a larger conversation about somebody like Amy Coney Barrett, who's a likely candidate. One of the 5, I think, finalists is what everyone pretty much assumes for Trump's reappointment of this position.
Well, she's not actually a real woman, though, because she doesn't support abortion rights.
So that was the headline, right, this morning? What was the headline? And it was a Yahoo News article that Amy Coney Barrett hates uteruses, or hates her uterus. I mean, that was an actual headline. I couldn't believe it. And it wasn't Babylon Bee. It wasn't, Onion. It was Yahoo News. This woman's had, what is it, 7 children or 8 children?
Right.
Like, I don't think she hates her uterus. I mean, this is a remarkable thing. But second wave feminism eventually became tied to, basically, to be a woman means to think that your body's design as a woman is a problem to be solved. That's a very different vision. And yet here we have somebody like Kim Colby, somebody like Amy Coney Barrett. Both have pursued law. Both have been excellent in their careers. Both have advanced freedom and justice, and did it without tying their cause, to this thing, this evil called abortion. So I guess, to our questioner specifically, going back to there, give a little grace to not expect everyone to say everything about everything. There's times that I, for example, quote Friedrich Nietzsche quite favorably, because he was right on some things. If God is dead, then Nietzsche is way closer than almost any other philosopher, in history.
Mm.
But and so there's things to look for. Ginsburg did accomplish some amazing things for Kim Colby and for Amy Coney Barrett and that sort of stuff, and yet she'll go down in history as tying that legacy to a movement that sees children as a problem to be solved, and the God-given capacity for procreation within women's bodies as a problem to be solved. And and that's just the reality. That's her legacy, both.
You know what else is interesting? Because you mentioned Amy Coney Barrett, and obviously we have no idea who's going to end up replacing Ginsburg on the bench. But there was a juxtaposition of headlines I saw this morning that really caught my attention, where Ginsburg was celebrated for a judicial philosophy that was rooted in her view of, what constitutes freedom, especially for women, and Coney Barrett was what all these female judges have three names. She was she was being excoriated for a remark she made at one point about how she sees her job as a judge in terms of building the kingdom of God, which of course is just a vanilla articulation of the idea of Christian vocation, right? We see everything as part of our work in building in the kingdom of God. That doesn't mean that she's going to be a religious dictator on the bench. But that's how a lot of, I think, progressive voices heard it. And it's just interesting, the celebration of Ginsburg's determination to bring her judicial philosophy and her view of freedom to bear on the bench, right next to this sort of pathological, or this insane fear that a Catholic woman is going to get on the bench and bring her philosophy of freedom and justice and so forth to bear. It's just a fascinating double standard there that I think is in the background of a lot of the commentary on Ginsburg's life and legacy here. And John, it's I think the even bigger point for me is that the Supreme Court has become something the founding fathers never intended it to be. I mean, the reason that we're having these knockdown, drag out battles every time a vacancy opens up, it's not because of who's in the White House. We would be having these same battles if it was Mitt Romney in the White House. I think ultimately the reason is because the Supreme Court has become a dictatorial power in our nation's political life, and it's become the only place where we can really go to resolve, or at least seem like we're resolving, big cultural battles. I mean, think back in the last decade, how many battles were resolved by Ruth Bader Ginsburg and company, as opposed to Mitch McConnell and company in the Senate.
It depends on what you mean by resolved. I would say none.
Right.
But how many were actually taken up where the legislature refused to do it?
Yeah.
And that's one after another. By the way, when you were comparing headlines, I thought you were going to compare. This was back-to-back days from Religion News Service. Okay.
Oh boy.
And not in the op-ed section. Okay. So these were none were opinion writers. So here's the headline. RGB, who had remained on SCOTUS despite suffering a long series of health challenges, rarely attended services, but she was passionate about Judaism's concern for justice and was shaped in the crucible of its minority status. And the headline is How Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg's Judaism Shaped Her Judicial Approach. Now, one day later, same service. And this is the headline, Amy Coney Barrett, controversial Catholic, reemerges as potential nominee. And that quote is, it's never appropriate for a judge to impose that judge's personal convictions, whether they arise from faith or anywhere else on the law, said Barrett. Nonetheless, her faith will be a point of tension if she's Trump's SCOTUS nominee. This is one day apart, both from a Religion News Service, and this is a really enjoyable, by the way, Twitter feed. We'll link to it at our in the show notes. I owe that, by the way, to Matt Hawkins from ERLC, and then I tweeted it, and it's kind of taken on a life of its own. And RNS is actually responding, basically saying no, it's completely justified to call Judaism an asset and Catholicism a liability.
Wow.
By the way, we're going to have a bigger conversation about this, obviously, this weekend on Breakpoint this week. And this isn't the nature of the question. So I want to be disciplined maybe and move on, because there's so many angles to talk about.
We could just keep on going. Yeah, but I hope
this could be the entire show, because we need to get to it, because it's your point.
Yeah.
The Supreme Court is doing something that it ought not do. there's the point of Kim Colby in our podcast, which I really hope people listen to. And she makes a very compelling argument that Professor Robbie George made also this morning on a very long Twitter thread, which again we'll link in the show notes, which is at the root of this is Roe v. Wade, that abortion poisoned the Supreme, well, abortion poisons everything, but it specifically poisoned the Supreme Court. And go back to the first one, which is the famous, Robert Bork, right? That was the first time this got out of hand.
And whose last name became a verb.
Well, yeah, that's right. And that's an interesting point. I think Trump might be the next one in history to become a verb. I mean, it was kind of
it was already a verb,
but it's going to be reverbed. There's going to be a Trump verb forever. But anyway, my point is that's another angle to talk about. Who are the likely nominees? That's another thing to talk about. What's this going to do to the election? It's a fascinating conversation. And it's not going to be over, on Saturday. In fact, when our Breakpoint This Week program airs is when the president is supposed to announce his pick. We'll record here's a little bit of the sausage making process. We record usually on Thursdays or early Friday mornings. It'll go live sometime midday Friday. And then, many people hear it on the radio on Saturday or on their podcast starting on Friday. And so much can change. You kind of feel like, man, so much can change between now and then. But there's so many angles of this story. Just when you thought 2020 could not get more interesting. And, listen, I want to reiterate, Ruth Bader Ginsburg is made in the image of God. She was a sinner, and she made horrible judicial decisions based on a wrong view of the world that was informed by an anti-creation sort of worldview. And that's a hard thing to say because she did remarkable things. And her giftedness, her talent was obvious. She was brilliant. She was sharp. I mean, what other Supreme Court? I was talking with Kim Colby about this, Shane. That I usually, when I talk about the impact of entertainment on making us dumb, kind of the Neil Postman, angle on entertainment, I'll say to my audience, I'll say something like, hey, if you stop the average person on the street and said, name 3 Supreme Court justices, how many could? And the answer is none. But if you said, name the 3 judges on American Idol or The Voice or America's Got Talent, they could, which says a lot about our country, that we know more about our entertainers. But I always said 3 because I figured that was safe, because I knew everyone knew RGB, right? Because she was or RBG. She was the Notorious. Like, she was named after a rapper. She had an icon. She has T-shirts. There is something historic about her time, and yet awful in terms of the legacy.
Yeah. One of the questions that we received this week is really pertinent to what we were just talking about defining what it means to what freedom means, what justice means. And it's a topic that has certainly been contentious at the Supreme Court lately. I'm thinking particularly of the clash between, religious freedom and so-called gay rights. So let's dive into this second question here. Reader asks, what's the difference between freedom of speech and freedom of expression? In today's warped-minded culture, I see a danger in freedom of expression, as in sexual expression, adults and children particularly. Please help me think clearly on the difference between freedom of speech and freedom of expression.
Yeah, what an interesting question, because I think really the root of the confusion, if you ask me, is not in the difference between speech and expression as much as it's in freedom, the word freedom. This falls under the category when in our book, A Practical Guide to Culture, we talk about the importance of defining terms as a way of developing discernment and teaching that question, what do you mean by that? And we highlight 4 or 5 or 6 words that are particularly troublesome in our culture: the word love, the word God, the word truth, the word marriage. But freedom is another one, because this goes to Os Guinness's tremendous book, A Free People's Suicide, in which he argues the greatest enemy of freedom is freedom. And this gets to the heart of the challenge of the question between freedom of speech and freedom of expression. The question is freedom, does freedom have limits, or does freedom not have limits? And at the root of that is a more fundamental question, Shane, which is, are we created or are we self-determined? if something is self-determined, then freedom is doing whatever you want, and any sort of restrictions violates freedom, right? And our dominant understanding of freedom today is a freedom from consequence, a freedom from definition, a freedom from restraint, a freedom from, any sort of rules or regulations whatsoever. If something is designed, then that something is most free, not when we do whatever we want with it, but when it is what it was created to be. I use the illustration often of being a pilot, which I'm not, but let's say I'm a pilot and I hop in a plane and I'm like, I'm feeling quite free today. I'm going to drive my plane down the interstate. Now, if I'm in a 747, no one's going to stop me. But then if I start trying to say, hey, I'm going to go see Pikes Peak, then my expression of freedom is going to get trapped on those curvy, windy roads. I should fly my plane because that's what a plane is designed to do. And I'm usually speaking to high schoolers, so I always say, a plane is most free when you fly it, not when you drive it. And by the way, for all the 15-year-olds, a car is most free when you drive it, not when you fly it, right? Because our expression of freedom actually leads to all kinds of consequence if there's a givenness to the world, if there's a design to who we are. We have a culture that's rejected the designer, so we have a culture that has redefined freedom to a freedom from restraint or consequence or anything like that, or rules. That's different than a vision of the world, which of course is seen in our founding documents, obviously in scripture as well, that the rights that we have, the freedoms that we have, are endowed by their creator. The creator line immediately implies freedom as being not from, but for. Freedom for life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, which, as we've talked before, and Chuck talked a lot about, is not giddiness or, just whatever makes you happy. It's actually the good life. It's this vision of virtuous living that brings about deep joy and satisfaction.
It's also not getting a job, although I really like the Will Smith movie by that name.
What are you talking about? Wait, what?
Pursuit of Happiness.
Oh, well, listen, that's
real
but he
tearjerker.
actually he actually exhibits what it really is about,
Yes,
this
yes.
freedom to actually go for something. But this is really what's behind it, because right now, freedom of speech and freedom of expression are seen differently, and that expression is being explored in a context where we think there's no design to male, female. There's no design to human beings. There's no limits to our freedom. But freedoms always have limits. Freedom of religion, as we said, you can't practice child sacrifice in your neighborhood,
Yeah.
right? That's a good limit.
Yeah, there are Mesoamerican religions historically that got people's still beating hearts out. We don't have the freedom to practice those religions according to their historic tradition in this country.
Yeah. And look, even if you boil it down to the most basic limits, it's that your freedom of expression should not harm someone else. And we've talked about this a number of times, that the freedom of expression, when it's been hijacked by a view of sexuality that is self-driven, that has no restraints whatsoever, that has no design, no purpose, but that actually is just about the pursuit of self-expression and autonomy, that then becomes what we have today, which is, let's sexually experiment on kids and say, oh, the kids will be fine. And Shane, we spent so much time on this last week, talking about the Cuties movie and all that, but I'm still deeply disturbed by that, because to the point of this question of freedom of expression, I heard NPR defend that movie this week along the lines of, either A, if you believe that pedophilia is a big problem, then you're probably part of QAnon, and B, that she was actually had good intentions. So the fact that she literally harmed little girls in the making of the movie, and didn't get to the conclusion, which is the second guessing of this new lifestyle by this 11-year-old girl by any moral framework, but just because of, the authentic journey. This was the argument from NPR. In other words, NPR, in their calm, cool, reasoned voices, defended a portrayal of pedophilia as an artistic good. That's a violation of any sort of freedom that has limits. That seems to me to be really, at least as we're seeing it in our warped, the question put it this way, in today's warped minded culture, that's the source of the warped mindedness. Are we designed or are we not? Are there limits to our God-given createdness, or are we self-determined? And expression today in the arts and everything else gets basically a freedom from anything sort of defining. And that's a real problem, especially for kids.
You know, in the American context, John, there's a confluence of two political traditions, two streams of thought that are coming together. There's the conservative tradition, which you might point to Burke as an example of that, and then there's the liberal tradition, liberal in the historic sense, not the more recent sense that comes from guys like Locke. And the Lockean tradition tends to emphasize negative rights. It tends to
Hmm.
say, well, stay out of my freedom of religion, stay out of my freedom to bear arms, stay out of my freedom over, to control my own body, stuff like that. It's negative expressions. And you see that manifested a lot in the Bill of Rights, because, Jefferson and company were drawing greatly from the Lockean tradition. But the conservative tradition gets to a question that's often neglected in the liberal tradition, and that is what freedom is for, what the positive aspect of freedom is. Where is it that, what is it that we're trying to preserve when we set up these boundaries that we call rights? Well, it's something within those. It's a precious thing called, being human. That's what freedom is really ultimately about. It's a teleological thing. It's the design that we're given by our Creator, and we're not free, like you said with the plane. We're not free to alter that design in radical ways. We're not free to make a plane into a car. And I always have to point to C.S. Lewis, but one of his best lines in Mere Christianity about this, it's a metaphor really, is the issue of autonomy and how it ultimately affects others. And he compares individuals to like a fleet of ships sailing along, and he says it's all very well and good to say that, well, I'm the captain of my ship, I should be able to do what I want with my ship and maintain it and sail it exactly as I choose, and nobody else has the right to tell me what I can and can't do with it. And to a certain extent, that's true. I mean, our Constitution does protect the right of individuals to do a great deal of stuff, including things that are not that are not in line with our design that we believe as Christians. However, there is a point at which you do so much damage, or you're so incompetent as a captain of your ship, that you're going to begin to crash into other people's ships. You're going to end up destroying other people's lives. And that's what we inevitably see, especially in issues of sexuality, because sex makes babies. That's the most obvious way that it harms other people. So you can't just pilot your ship, meaning your individual life, however you choose, because ultimately it does affect other people. It does damage them without their consent or say so. And we need a mechanism to protect those vulnerable individuals. So, I mean, that's the I guess the broad framework politically for what the questioner is getting at here, in the difference between freedom of speech or religion, I might add, and freedom of expression. Freedom of expression, I'm not really sure what it means. I'm no legal expert, but I'm not really sure what it's supposed to mean. Freedom
Well,
is well defined.
judicially, expression has been defended as a kind of speech, right?
Okay.
So this is, for example, when Jack Phillips went to the Supreme Court, they were arguing his ability to make cakes is more than just what he's doing in commerce, but that he's
Artistic
actually
expression.
artistic expression, right?
Yeah.
So that's kind of how it's used. But my point, and your point, quoting that line from Lewis and so on, is that it's just been untethered from anything given. And look, the freedom to wrestle with what is actually there is an important part of what it means to be human. Um, our freedom from what is there, that is the best subtitle or the best title of any book that I've ever seen, which is Greg Kokel and Frank Beckwith's book, Relativism: Feet Firmly Planted in Midair. That's pretty much where this lands. So yeah,
It gets
that's
back
where the
to
idea of expression comes legally.
it gets back to a question that I discussed with Carl Trueman on my podcast Upstream about his new book, where he talks about a shift that happened in the birth of expressive individualism from conception of our being subject to an external order, where the world is created in a certain way, and freedom means, being human means conforming to that order, and then you will thrive because of that. To now we've adopted a conception of freedom where we actually impose our will on the
Right.
external order, that external order including our own bodies in many cases. And he says that
Yeah.
transgenderism is the inevitable end result. Maybe not end result. He doesn't claim to know what could come next, but it's an inevitable end result of this belief that we can just impose our wills on the world around us. But it's a reductio ad absurdum in many ways. You know, it's a logical conclusion of that belief that is so obviously stupid and absurd, and yet people are accepting it because they've already accepted the premises earlier up that we, you know, or further upstream, so to speak, that we do get to define reality according to our whims and not according to how God has created it.
Yeah.
Well, we are out of time for today. Thanks so much for listening to the Breakpoint podcast, folks. We'll be back next week answering more of your worldview questions. Please drop us a message on social media or email at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org. And we'd love to engage with it. For John Stone Street and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. Thanks so much for listening.